The tenement hallway was too dark, the kind of oppressive gloom that settles in a condemned building where the air smells of damp rot and the flickering lights buzz like they are holding their breath. Lee Sung-kyun adjusted his silk cuffs before he heard the sound. Then it came, the scuffle of desperate sneakers sliding against sticky linoleum. A little girl scrambled out of the shadows, looking like she was running from a nightmare made flesh. Her oversized hoodie hung off her small frame, her chest heaved for air. Her eyes were wide with a terror that made her look much older than 7. Lee paused, his presence in the corridor like a statue in a ruin. But she didn't run past him. She stopped right in front of him. She pressed herself against the peeling wall, shrinking away from the corridor behind her. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the lights. "Please, sir, let me hide here." Before he could speak, she squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a blow. That's when Lee saw them. 2 heavy-set men round the corner, leather jackets, the distinct metallic glint of weapons tucked into waistbands, eyes scanning the filth. The girl's breathing stopped altogether. "They'll kill me," she breathed. "I saw them." The men froze. Because they hadn't just cornered a helpless witness in a slum. They had walked straight into the path of the dragon of the Geumga Syndicate, and the little girl trembling behind his tailored overcoat had no idea she had just summoned the most dangerous protection in the city. Welcome back to the gallery. Stay with me till the end. Show some love by hitting like and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from, and you're absolutely amazing. Let's get into the story. Lee Sung-kyun wasn't a man who belonged in these streets. He was the man who owned them. He controlled shipping lines, luxury hotels, and tech firms, empires that shone with legitimacy on the surface, but were rooted in absolute discipline beneath. In 20 years, he had solidified his rule over the city's underworld without ever needing to dirty his hands. In his world, a single look commanded silence. But there were codes, lines that even the ruthless did not blur. Involving children was one of them. So when the 2 traffickers in the hallway recognized the gold pin on his lapel, when the color drained from their faces and one of them lowered his weapon in pure reflex, Lee already knew the balance of power had shifted. The girl at his feet was shaking, clutching the hem of his trousers like a lifeline. "I didn't mean to see," she cried softly. "I just wanted to go home." Lee's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened into lethal focus. Because this wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a breach of his territory and an insult to his order. And before the night ended, Lee Sung-kyun would ensure that Viktor Petrov learned a fatal lesson. You do not hunt children in the dragon's garden. Kiyah was no longer prey, she was under management. The heavier of the 2 men stepped forward, his boots crunching on broken glass. He wore a leather jacket that creaked with every movement, and his eyes flicked greedily to the small sliver of Kiyah visible behind Lee's trench coat. "Step aside, suit," the man grunted, extending a hand stained with engine grease. "The kid belongs to us." Lee didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply looked down at his own wrist, meticulously adjusting the silver cufflink that had shifted slightly during the collision. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly casual given the weapons bulging beneath the stranger's jackets. Kiyah buried her face into the back of his knee, her trembling vibrating up through his leg.
"You are mistaken," Lee said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to drop the temperature in the hallway. He finally raised his eyes, locking onto the thug. "Nothing in this building belongs to you. Not the air you are breathing, not the floor you are standing on, and certainly not the child." The second man scoffed, reaching for the pistol at his waistband. "Do you know who we work for? Viktor Petrov doesn't like—" "Petrov," Lee interrupted, testing the name like a bad wine. Russian, loud, messy. He took a single step forward, the expensive leather of his shoes making no sound. You are standing in the Geumga district, my district. The realization hit the first thug like a physical blow. The color drained from his face as he looked at the gold dragon pin on Lee's lapel. He grabbed his partner's arm, stopping him from drawing the gun. "Geumga," he muttered, the word tasting like ash. "This is the dragon." "You have 5 seconds," Lee whispered, "to vanish." The hallway suddenly felt crowded. From the darkened stairwell behind the thugs, 3 figures emerged. They wore suits identical in cut to Lee's, moving with the silent lethality of shadows detaching from a wall. The click of safety catches disengaging echoed through the silence. The thugs froze, trapped between the dragon and his teeth. The leader spat on the floor, trying to salvage a scrap of pride. "You're making a mistake," he snarled, backing away slowly. "Petrov wants what he paid for. You keep her, you buy a war." "I am not buying anything," Lee replied, his face an impassive mask. "I am taking out the trash." The men turned and fled, their footsteps retreating into the human afternoon. Lee waited until the heavy iron door slammed shut before he exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders. He felt a small tug on his coat. He looked down. Kiyah was peering up at him, her eyes wide with awe and confusion. "Are you a bad man?" she whispered. Lee smoothed his coat, looking at the door where the monsters had just left. "For them," he said softly, "I am the nightmare."
The private elevator hummed, a sound so smooth it was barely audible, carrying them from the gutter to the gods in seconds. When the doors hissed open, the air changed instantly, cool, filtered, and smelling faintly of sandalwood and emptiness. Lee stepped out, his heels clicking rhythmically on the polished marble. He took 3 paces before realizing he was walking alone. He stopped and turned. Kiyah stood frozen at the threshold of the elevator, her small hands gripping her hoodie until her knuckles turned white. She was staring at the penthouse as if it were an alien planet. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls displayed the city skyline, a glittering ocean of lights that made the room feel suspended in the void. Everything was white, chrome, or black leather, sterile, perfect. And she was covered in the grime of the tenement. "Come," Lee said, gesturing vaguely toward the living area. Kiyah shook her head, looking down at her battered, muddy sneakers. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll make it dirty." Lee looked at the pristine white floor, then at the girl who looked like she expected to be beaten for leaving a footprint. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, an irritation not at her, but at a world that had taught a child to apologize for existing. "It is stone," Lee said flatly. "It washes." He walked back to her, looming tall in his dark coat. He reached out to guide her, but she flinched, shrinking back against the elevator door. Lee's hand froze in midair. He was used to men who feared him, but this was different. This was a fear of everything. He lowered his hand slowly, realizing his authority meant nothing here. "Miss Park?" he called out, his voice returning to its usual sharp command. The housekeeper appeared from the hallway, a woman of efficient silence. She took in the scene, the dirt, the terror, the Mafia Boss standing awkwardly with a hand half raised, without blinking.
"Draw a bath," Lee ordered, stripping off his overcoat and tossing it carelessly onto a $5,000 chair to prove a point. "Burn those rags. Get her something warm, soft." He paused, looking at Kiyah's hollow cheeks. "And food, whatever she wants, but nothing spicy."
Miss Park nodded and gently ushered the girl forward. Kiyah moved stiffly, her eyes darting from Lee to the furniture she was too afraid to touch. She looked like a stray cat cornered in a laboratory. Lee watched them go, then walked to the wet bar. He poured a glass of water, his reflection caught in the dark window. Perfect suit, perfect hair, perfect isolation. He had brought a witness into his fortress, but looking at the small smudge of mud left on his marble entryway, he realized with a sinking feeling that he had no idea how to talk to a child who didn't know the language of power. "Sit," he had almost told her earlier, like a dog. He took a sip of water, the silence of the apartment suddenly feeling very loud. He was a general in war, but in this he was completely unarmed. An hour later, Kiyah sat at the end of a dining table long enough to land a plane on. She was scrubbed clean, wearing a soft gray tracksuit that swallowed her small frame, but she hadn't touched the porcelain bowl in front of her. Miss Park stood in the corner, her frustration radiating in silent waves. "She will not eat, sir," the housekeeper murmured as Lee entered. "She hasn't said a word." Lee waved Miss Park away. He approached the table, the silence stretching taut between them. Kiyah watched him, her eyes darting to the steaming bowl of rice and broth, then back to his face. She was waiting for the trap to spring. Lee pulled out the heavy chair beside her, not at the head of the table, but close enough to be heard without shouting. He picked up a spoon, dipped it into the bowl, and took a bite. He swallowed, then placed the spoon back in the bowl, handle pointing toward her. "It is not poisoned," he said quietly, "and it costs more than the building you were hiding in." Kiyah hesitated, her stomach giving a traitorous growl. Slowly, she picked up the spoon. The first bite was tentative, the second was ravenous. Lee waited until she had slowed down before he spoke. "Why were you in the basement?" Kiyah froze, the spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. She lowered it slowly. "I sleep there," she whispered, "behind the boiler. It's warm." "And the men?" "They brought a man in," she said, her voice dropping so low Lee had to lean in. "They were yelling, Russian words. Then a loud noise, like a firecracker, but wet." She shuddered, staring into the broth. The man stopped moving. Lee's eyes narrowed. An execution, sloppy. "Did they see you?" "No, but one of them dropped a book, a little black one." Kiyah tapped her temple. "He picked it up fast, but it fell open. I saw the numbers." "Numbers?" Lee asked, his interest sharpening from protective to professional. "It was a code," Kiyah said, reciting a string of digits and letters with the mechanical precision of a recording device. A74 Bravo X-ray. Then a list, dates, money. Lee sat back, the air leaving his lungs. She hadn't just witnessed a murder, she had seen Petrov's ledger, the encryption key to his entire trafficking network. The Russian wasn't hunting a runaway child because he was cruel. He was hunting her because she was a walking, breathing hard drive that could dismantle his operation. He looked at the small girl scraping the bottom of the bowl, oblivious to the fact that the numbers in her head were worth millions in blood money. She wasn't just a stray anymore. She was the most dangerous weapon in the city, and she was sitting in his dining room. "Eat," Lee commanded softly, staring at the window where the city lights burned. "You are going to need the strength." The vibration of the phone against the mahogany desk sounded like a death rattle in the silent office. Lee did not pick it up immediately. He watched the screen illuminate, displaying an unknown number that he already knew by heart. Behind him, through the open door of the study, for conspiracies. He swiped the screen. "Speak." "You are a hard man to reach, Sung-kyun," Viktor Petrov's voice rasped through the speaker, thick with the scent of cheap vodka and expensive cigars.
and you are holding something that does not belong to me." "I am holding a child," Lee replied, his voice a flat line. "In my world, children are not property." "Don't play the saint with me. We both know what she saw. That girl is a leak in my hull, and I do not like to sink." Petrov's tone shifted, the faux joviality dropping away to reveal the jagged edge of a threat. "Give her to me by dawn. We forget the trespassing. We keep the shipping lanes open. Peace is profitable, Lee. War is expensive." The line went dead. Lee looked up to find his two senior advisors, Park and Troy, standing in the doorway. They had heard enough. Park, the elder of the two, stepped forward, his face etched with the pragmatic coldness that had kept the syndicate alive for decades. "The Russians are volatile, Chairman," Park said softly. "The shipping lanes in the north are already seeing friction. If we refuse Petrov over a witness, the Benedetto family will see it as an opening. They will back the Russians just to watch us bleed. One girl is not worth the empire."
"She is a witness to a murder," Lee said, his gaze fixed on Kiyah's rhythmic breathing. "She is a liability," Choi added, his voice devoid of empathy. "Hand her over. We can negotiate a guarantee for her safety if it eases your conscience, but we cannot burn the city for a stray." Lee didn't answer. He walked into the living room, his footsteps silent on the marble. He stood over the sofa, looking down at the girl. She shifted in her sleep, a small, involuntary whimper escaping her lips as she gripped the pillow tighter. She had run to him. Out of all the people in that dark tenement, she had chosen his shadow to hide in. He looked back at his advisors, men who saw the world in ledgers and loss. Then he looked at the phone in his hand, the device that held Petrov's ultimatum. His fingers tightened. The high-end glass and titanium groaned under the pressure of a grip that had snapped bones in darker alleys than this. With a sickening crack, the screen shattered, spiderwebbing beneath his thumb. The electronics sparked and died. Lee opened his hand, letting the ruined shards of technology clatter into a designer wastebasket. "Inform the suit division," Lee said, not looking back. "There will be no peace." The explosion didn't just shatter glass, it tore through the fragile illusion of Lee's legitimacy. At 3 a.m, the Sky Garden, Lee's flagship restaurant and the crown jewel of the Geumga district, was reduced to a skeletal cage of twisted steel and burning velvet. When Lee arrived, the flashing red lights of the emergency vehicles reflected in his eyes, but he didn't look like a CEO anymore. He had discarded his tie, his shirt collar was open, and the cold boardroom composure had been replaced by a predatory stillness that made even the firemen keep their distance. He walked past the police tape, his shoes crunching over the shards of a Swarovski chandelier. The scent of ozone and expensive upholstery hung heavy in the air. He didn't need to see the Russian signature left in the wreckage to know it was Petrov. This wasn't just an attack, it was a loud, crude scream for attention. Lee reached into the ruins of a charred table and pulled out a singed napkin. He didn't speak to the detectives or the press. He turned to his lieutenant, Tony, who was waiting in the shadows of a nearby pillar. "Petrov thinks I am a businessman who forgot how to bleed," Lee said, his voice a low, guttural rasp that carried more weight than the sirens. "Remind him that I didn't build this city with signatures. I built it with bone." He pulled a small black transceiver from his pocket, a device reserved for the Geumga's deepest operations. "Issue a red notice," he commanded. "Every shipment, every warehouse, every soldier under the Petrov name, I want them erased. No negotiations, no survivors." The suit, had officially fallen away. The dragon was no longer managing an empire, he was hunting. Before the sun could rise, Lee returned to the penthouse. He found Kiyah standing in the middle of the living room, her eyes wide as she watched the news coverage of the fire. She looked at him, seeing the soot on his sleeves and the raw, unmasked fury in his gaze. For a second, she shrank back, the old fear returning. "The bad men?" she whispered. Lee's expression softened, but only for her. He knelt, meeting her at eye level, his hands steady as he placed them on her shoulders. "They can't get in here, Kiyah, but I need you to go somewhere even safer." He led her to the back of his library, where a seamless bookshelf swung open to reveal a reinforced steel door. The panic room was filled with soft lights, books, and a bed. It was a fortress within a fortress. "I have to go away for a little while," he told her, his voice firm. "Stay here. Ms. Park will bring you whatever you need. Do not come out until you hear my voice." Kiyah reached out, her small fingers brushing the gold dragon pin on his lapel. "Will you come back?" Lee closed his hand over hers, his grip a silent vow. "I am the only thing they should be afraid of now." He stepped out, and the heavy door hissed shut, sealing her in silence as Lee Sung-kyun walked back into the war he had just started. The silence of the penthouse was unnatural, a heavy shroud that Kiyah didn't trust. Inside the panic room, the air felt recycled and cold. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She had spent years navigating the vents of tenement buildings and the hollows of sub-basements. She knew when the rhythm of a house changed. A soft thud, the sound of a body hitting marble, echoed through the vents. Then came the high-pitched whine of a security system being bypassed. Miss Park didn't scream. That was the first sign that the fortress had failed. Kiyah didn't stay on the bed. Her street instincts, honed by hunger and pursuit, told her that a box was just a coffin if the wrong person had the key. She squeezed through the heavy door just as it began to cycle open, slipping into the library's shadows. She didn't run for the front door. She climbed. She wedged herself into the narrow gap between a massive mahogany bookshelf and the ceiling, a trick she'd used to hide from social workers and debt collectors alike. A man entered the library. He didn't look like the thugs from the alley. He moved like a ghost, a serrated blade held low, his eyes scanning the room with thermal goggles. He reached the panic room and hissed in frustration when he found it empty. He turned, his gaze sweeping the shelves. Kiyah held her breath until her lungs burned, pressing her small frame into the dust and darkness. The elevator chimes rang out, a herald of death. Lee Sung-kyun stepped into the foyer, his movements fueled by a desperate, silent rage. He didn't call out for her. He knew the air was tainted. The assassin lunged from the library, a blur of black fabric and steel. Lee didn't flinch. He caught the man's wrist, the sound of snapping bone cracking through the opulent space.
The fight was a collision of precision and brutality. They crashed into a grass display case, shattering ancient porcelain. Lee ignored the blood blooming on his white shirt, his focus singular and terrifying. He pinned the assassin against the marble island, his fingers finding the man's throat with the same lethal grace he used to adjust his cufflinks. "Where is she?" Lee's voice was a low, vibrating growl. The assassin gasped, his eyes bulging. Lee didn't wait for an answer. With a sickening twist, the struggle ended. The body slumped to the floor, leaving a dark smear on the pristine white stone. "Kiyah!" Lee shouted, his composure finally breaking. A small, dusty figure dropped from the shadows of the ceiling. Kiyah didn't hesitate. She ran to him, burying her face in his blood-stained vest. Lee scooped her up,
his hands shaking as he pressed her head against his shoulder. He looked at the shattered glass, the dead man, and the city lights mocking him from outside. The penthouse, his throne, had become a cage. He realized then that walls were useless against a man like Petrov. As long as the Russian drew breath, the world would remain a graveyard. The penthouse was a wreckage of broken glass and shattered security, but the small medical kit on the kitchen island was a beacon of sterile order. Lee sat on a stool, his movements stiff from the adrenaline fade, while Kiyah sat before him. A jagged scrape ran across her knee, a souvenir from her scramble into the library's rafters. With hands that had spent the evening gripped around a weapon, Lee now held a cotton swab soaked in antiseptic. He was remarkably gentle, his touch possessing a precision that bypassed her instinct to flinch. The sharp scent of the medicine filled the space between them, masking the lingering smell of gunpowder.
"Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Kiyah shook her head, though her lower lip trembled. She wasn't looking at the wound, she was looking at the dark stain on Lee's shoulder where the assassin's blade had grazed him. "You're bleeding too," she whispered. "I've had worse from falling off a bicycle as a boy," Lee lied, his eyes never leaving his work. He applied a bandage with practiced ease, smoothing the edges down with his thumb. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the dead man in the other room and the war screaming outside the windows. Kiyah pulled her knees to her chest, looking small against the vastness of the marble kitchen. "Are you going to send me away now?" she asked, her voice small and hollow. Because the bad men keep coming for me?" Lee paused. He looked at his hands, then at the girl who had turned his world into a battlefield. By every logic of the syndicate, she was a death sentence. To keep her was to invite a storm that might drown them both. Slowly, Lee reached into the inner pocket of his vest. He pulled out a small silk pouch and withdrew a pendant carved from deep, translucent green jade. It was a dragon, coiled and fierce, suspended on a simple black cord. It was a relic of his own lineage, a symbol of the Geumga bloodline that he had carried since his initiation. He crouched down, descending from his height to meet her at eye level. The position was no longer one of tactical control. It was a surrender of his own distance. He looped the cord around her neck, the jade cold against her skin. "In my culture, this means you are under the protection of the house," Lee said, his gaze locked onto hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "It means you are no longer a guest, Kiyah. You are family. And in this family, we do not run, and we do not leave each other behind." He placed a hand over the amulet, his palm warm against her chest. "Family stays. Do you understand?" Kiyah looked down at the green stone, then back at the man the world called a monster. For the first time since the alley, the trembling stopped. She nodded, reaching out to take his hand. Lee squeezed back, his face hardening into a mask of lethal resolve. The promise was made. Now, he just had to kill everyone who intended to make him break it. The fog rolling off the harbor was thick and salted with the scent of diesel, but it couldn't mask the smell of the gasoline Lee's men had poured across the perimeter. Standing on the rusted bow of a derelict freighter, Lee Sung-kyun looked down at the sprawling shipyard that served as Viktor Petrov's heart. He didn't give a speech, he didn't offer a prayer. He simply adjusted his gloves and spoke 2 words into his comms. "Burn it down." The night ignited. A coordinated bloom of thermite charges shattered the silence, blooming like hellish flowers across the shipyard's gates. From the shadows, the suit division moved with the synchronized grace of a single lethal machine. They didn't shout, They simply filtered through the smoke, silenced submachine guns coughing in rhythmic intervals. Lee descended into the chaos like a ghost seeking vengeance. He moved through the shipping containers, his black overcoat billowing behind him. When 3 of Petrov's guards intercepted him, Lee didn't reach for a gun. He moved inside their guard, his hands a blur of bone-breaking precision. He redirected a rifle barrel with a palm strike, snapped a collarbone with his elbow, and finished the last man with a revolving kick that sent him crashing into a stack of oil drums. It wasn't just a fight, it was a stylistic massacre, a display of martial perfection fueled by cold, unadulterated rage. The path to the central office was paved in spent casings and the wreckage of Petrov's empire. Lee kicked the steel doors open to find Viktor Petrov frantically shoving ledgers into a briefcase. The Russian scrambled for a pistol on his desk, but Lee was faster. He closed the distance in 3 strides, his hand catching Petrov's wrist and slamming it against the desk with enough force to shatter the wood.
Petrov gasped, looking up into eyes that held no mercy, only the finality of a closed book. "Wait, Lee! Think about the business, the money!" "You threatened family," Lee interrupted, his voice a whisper that cut through the sound of the distant sirens. "There is no profit in that." Lee didn't hesitate. He pulled the jade-handled dagger from his belt, the twin to the amulet Kiyah now wore. With a single surgical movement, he ended the threat that had haunted the little girl's dreams. He didn't look back as Petrov slumped over his desk. As Lee walked out of the office, the shipyard was a wall of orange flame. He paused for a moment, the heat on his face a stark contrast to the ice in his veins. He pulled out a clean handkerchief, wiped a small smudge of blood from his cheek, and dropped the cloth into the fire. The witness was safe. The debt was paid. The dragon was going home. The morning sun filtered through the cherry blossoms of the private school courtyard, casting soft, dappled shadows over the iron gates. It was a far cry from the damp, flickering hallways where they had first met. Lee Sung-kyun stood by the black sedan, his silhouette as sharp and commanding as ever. He wore a navy suit, tailored to perfection, but the predatory edge that usually defined his posture had softened into something resembling peace. He wasn't checking his watch, nor was he scanning the rooftops for threats. For the first time in 20 years, his time belonged to someone else. The school bell rang, a bright chime that signaled the end of the day. A stream of children burst from the doors, a sea of neat uniforms and laughter. Among them, Kiyah was easy to spot. Her hair was braided with silk ribbons, her backpack was no longer torn but sturdy and new, and her face held the glow of a child who slept without listening for footsteps.
She was walking with a classmate, chatting animatedly. As she caught sight of Lee, her eyes lit up with a spark of recognition that transcended the debt of a survivor to a savior. "Appa!" she called out, the Korean word for father rolling off her tongue with natural, practiced ease. She sprinted toward him, her pleated skirt fluttering. 6 months ago, she had run to him to hide. Today, she ran to him to be seen. Lee didn't wait for her to reach him. He stepped forward, crouched low, meeting her at eye level, just as he had in the tenement, and opened his arms. She collided with him, a whirlwind of energy and joy. Lee stood up, lifting her effortlessly, the weight of her life a light burden compared to the empires he had moved to keep her. "Did you learn your vocabulary?" he asked, his voice no longer a baritone of command, but a low murmur of affection. "I did," she said proudly, adjusting the jade dragon amulet that still hung around her neck, hidden safely beneath her collar. "And I got an A in math.
The numbers were easy. Lee smiled, a rare, genuine expression that didn't appear in his dossiers or on the news. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his hand steady and warm. The world still knew him as the dragon, a man of shadows and steel, but in this quiet corner of the city, he was simply the harbor. The little girl who hadn't known he was a mafia boss had changed him more than any war ever could. He ushered her into the car, the door closing with a solid, protective thud. As they drove away from the gates, Lee didn't look back at the city he ruled. He looked only at the girl beside him, knowing that while he had once built a kingdom of fear, he had finally grown a garden worth guarding.